You are listening to Jewish History from the Inside Out, an analysis of Chazal in the context of conventional history. This Chanukah series is dedicated in loving memory of Shneir Zalman Olav Hashalom ben Harav Menachem Mendel Sheyichya. May his memory be a blessing. Welcome to Jewish History from the Inside Out, Episode 4, Part 2. In this episode, we finally resolve the discrepancies between the secular account of the Chanukah story and that of Chazal. Remember, we are operating from the inside out, looking first to Chazal and only later to external sources for context and explanation. As we do our best to reconcile the accounts, please bear in mind what was made abundantly clear in Part 1. That there is not a single unified secular account, but rather a collection of disparate and often contradictory narratives. Historians, like politicians, are merely people, and people carry biases and are motivated by agendas. These inevitably influence the writing and recording of their narratives. The only difference between an honest and dishonest historian is that the latter lies outright, while the former merely omits. Each presents a story consistent with his agenda. One muddies the historical records, the other leaves holes in it. Still, it is easier to fill in gaps left by honest historians than to undo the lies of the falsifiers of history. The authors of Maccabees 1 and 2 clearly have their biases and agendas, but we have no reason to suspect either of them of outright falsehood. The discrepancies and inconsistencies that emerge between them may well be the result of different historical traditions or of the conflation of various accounts. When either one of them encounters a fact that runs contrary to the narrative he is trying to convey, he simply ignores it. Maccabees 1 is intent on presenting a glorious dynastic history of the Hashmonaim, and to have it extend as far back as possible. The farther back it goes, the more prestigious the account. It seeks to present an unbroken chain of events that progressed and developed as time went on. Setbacks are recorded and not ignored, but any overt failure is attributed to others and not to the house of Hashmonai. The author explicitly emphasizes the fact that the brothers, in particular Yehuda and Shimon, were chosen for their roles by God, and has a distinctly pro-Shimon bias. Maccabees 2 is interested in presenting an exciting and instructive moral tale in which the righteous first suffer miserably for God's sake, but ultimately emerge victorious in the end. Any information that would seem to contradict this idea is omitted. Additionally, Maccabees 2 is clearly anti-Shimon, omitting one or two of his victories and showcasing his failures. Now let us begin the work of resolving the disparate accounts of Chanukah. Our story begins in the village of Modin, during the reign of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, ruler of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid officer Apelles has ordered Matisyahu, leader of the faithful Jews of Modin, to offer up a pig on the pagan altar he has erected. Matisyahu refuses, kills Apelles, and runs for the hills. The Maccabee revolt has begun. After a year leading the revolt, Matisyahu dies and appoints his eldest son Yehuda in his place. The faithful Jews of Israel suffer 3.5 years of religious persecution and spiritual annihilation. The temple is desecrated, its vessels are plundered, and it is turned into a shrine to a pagan deity. Yehuda, his brothers, and their band of Maccabees fight a series of battles against the mighty Seleucid army. Finally, after the fourth battle, they conquered Jerusalem and reach the Holy Temple. The terrible desecration that meets their eyes is horrifying to them, and they immediately set about cleansing and rebuilding the temple. A new altar is constructed in place of the old one that has been profaned. Finally, on the 25th day of Kislev, in the year 164 BCE, the work is complete, and the temple service is observed once again. Sacrifices are offered on the altar, the menorah is lit in the sanctuary, and a holiday is declared. Yehuda sends letters to the Jewish communities, encouraging them to celebrate this holiday of Chanukah Series, the rededication of the temple and its altar, for 8 days. Why 8? This will be explained at the end of this episode. Not long thereafter, there are a series of assaults on the Jewish settlements in the border towns, and Yehuda launches a rescue operation that successfully leads those communities to safety. Chanukah that year was probably celebrated under fire. Then, Antiochus V, Eupator, and his viceroy Lysias, under the incitement of the evil high priest Menelaus, lead a huge army to attack the Jews in Judea. A battle is fought at Beis Zechariah, in which Elazar dies while attacking the lead elephant. It must have been strange celebrating Chanukah under such circumstances, beleaguered in a newly rebuilt Beis Hamikdash. Finally, when the siege is lifted and Antiochus Eupator is killed by Demetrius, new troubles begin brewing. It is at this point that we pick up the story from the vantage point of the scroll of Antiochus. In episode 3, we explained how all of the identifying details presented in the opening section of the scroll point to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We took the meaning of the 23rd year of his reign to mean the 23rd year of collective Seleucid rule over Israel. Although I believe that is a valid interpretation, I would like to further propose that the name Antiochus is used by Chazal as a common name for all kings of the Seleucid Greek Empire. In much the same way that Pharaoh is used in the Torah for all kings of Egypt, Avimelech for all Philistine kings, Hiram for all kings of Tyre, and so on and so forth. Demetrius I, Demetrius Soter, could therefore conceivably be referred to by Chazal as Antiochus. Though not quite as impressive as his uncle, Antiochus IV, he had indeed conquered many lands, and for a brief time even managed to unify the Seleucid Empire. He killed the rebellious satrap Timarchus, and for doing so he was called Soter, Savior, by the Babylonians, a title he adored. As far as having built the city of Antioch, well, Josephus tells us that he built a castle of 4 towers in the vicinity of Antioch. We will have more to say on Demetrius's castle later on. The 23rd year of his reign could easily be interpreted as the 23rd year of his life, and indeed, that's exactly how old Demetrius was when he escaped Rome and took the throne. Immediately thereafter, he was approached by Alcimus to enforce Hellenistic practice in the land of Israel. I would postulate that the identifying passages are deliberately opaque so as to refer to both Demetrius and Antiochus. After all, both caused untold suffering for the Jews, and it would be inconceivable to reference the nephew and not the uncle. The specific decrees against Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, or the festivals, and circumcision are explicitly attributed by both books of Maccabees to Antiochus Epiphanes. One of two things must then be true. Either A, these decrees were enacted by Demetrius as well, or B, the scroll is incorporating all of the decrees imposed upon the Jews by the various Seleucid kings into a single narrative. I believe either position is acceptable. At this point in the story, we will adhere to the account in Maccabees 2, in which Nicanor is sent with Alcimus to Judea before Bacchides, as it comports with the scroll narrative. Josephus says Alcimus asked Demetrius to send one of his most trustworthy people to see for himself what was going on in Judea. It would make sense, then, that Demetrius should send Nicanor, a person he obviously trusted since they had escaped from Rome together, rather than Bacchides, an old friend of his uncle whose son Demetrius had just put to death. To be sure, Maccabees 1 does write that Bacchides was a faithful ally of King Demetrius, but I still find Maccabees 2's account more convincing. I will explain later why Maccabees 1 placed Bacchides' first visit to Judea prior to Nicanor's. The scroll further recounts that Nicanor arrived in the Holy Land and killed many people. Indeed, we are informed by Maccabees 2 that when Nicanor arrived in the Holy Land, he fought Shimon near the village of Dessau and destroyed his army. Now, whatever version of the initial interaction between Nicanor and Yehuda you may choose to believe is immaterial. Personally, I am inclined towards that of Maccabees 2, where they begin on good terms until things deteriorate due to Alcimus's meddling. My reasoning is as follows. The corresponding account in Megillus Tainus has Nicanor on his way to Alexandria, implying that Judea was merely a stop on his trip to get a sense of the state of things as Alcimus had suggested. Why should Nicanor be in a hurry to instate Alcimus? According to all accounts, the Holy Temple was under the influence of the faithful Jews when Nicanor arrived, and there is no indication it had ever been under Alcimus's control. It would appear that Alcimus had not been appointed high priest up to this point. When Alcimus sensed that he might not be granted the high priesthood after all, he hurried back to Antioch. Demetrius sent a message admonishing Nicanor. Yehuda, sensing danger, escaped. At that point, Nicanor arrogantly barged into the temple. Now, most versions of the scroll have Nicanor building an altar in the holy temple, presumably to sacrifice a swine. This would have been an extensive project, and would have had to have been mentioned by at least one of the historians. Significantly, Rasag's version states only that he placed an idol in the holy temple, a feat that could be accomplished in no time at all. The scroll continues. At that time, a swine was slaughtered, and its blood brought into the holy courtyard. It does not say where the swine was slaughtered, nor that it was offered on the altar. Again, though there is no explicit mention of this act in either book of Maccabees, Maccabees 1 does state that, quote, Nicanor defiled the priests and spoke blasphemy. It does not state exactly how Nicanor defiled the priests, and some conjecture that he spat on them, as indicated in Josephon. I would contend he defiled them by sprinkling the blood of the swine. Then, after threatening to burn the temple and raze it to the ground, Nicanor turns and leaves. The Kohanim fall to the ground and beseech God to not allow the temple to be desecrated once again. It is at this point that we encounter Yochanan, son of Mattisyahu, high priest of the Jews. The fact of Yochanan's high priesthood is not mentioned anywhere outside of Chazal. But rather than asking why his high priesthood is omitted from the historical record, you might be better served to ask why Yochanan's entire life story is omitted from the record. It's almost as if he never existed. In the entire book of Maccabees, Yochanan is mentioned exactly 3 times. Once, when he is listed as the oldest of the 5 Maccabee brothers, a second time at the Battle of Emmaus, and a third time when he was killed by the Arabs of Medva. He does not appear at any other times. Where, oh where is Yochanan? I would like to propose the following. The reason Yochanan does not appear in all of Maccabees is because from the time the Beis Hamikdash was restored, in the year 164 BCE, Yochanan served as Kohen Gadol. He could not take part in the wars because he was engaged in the holy service. It is quite certain that after the Beis Hamikdash was cleansed, neither Menelaus nor any of the other Hellenists had access to it. Who then was the Kohen Gadol? Had Yehuda been Kohen Gadol, we would have heard about it in the book of Maccabees. To be perfectly transparent, Josephus does mention that Yehuda became Kohen Gadol at a certain point, but most scholars agree Josephus is not to be trusted on this point, as there is no indication of this at all in Maccabees. Besides, al derech hapilpul, if we are to believe Maccabees too, Yehuda was unmarried until he met Nicanor, and as such could not possibly have served in the temple on Yom Kippur, when the Torah requires that the Kohen Gadol be married. But there's more to it than that. If Yochanan was Kohen Gadol during Yehuda's lifetime, then it should stand to reason that he would retain the high priesthood even after Yehuda's death, when the mantle of leadership passed to Yonasan. It would further stand to reason that upon Yochanan's death, the high priesthood would pass to one of his, Yochanan's, children, even as Yonasan led the people. But what actually happened? As we learned in part 1, Yonasan donned the holy garments on the holiday of Sukkot in the year 152 BCE. Now 152 is 12 years after 164, when the temple was restored. Who was Kohen Gadol in all that time? Even if we give Alkimus 4 years, as Josephus would have us do, who was Kohen Gadol for the remaining 8? Avram Kahana, in his authoritative edition of Maccabees, blithely states, quote, "There was no high priest for 7 years prior to Shimon's ascent." Really? No high priest for 7 years? Such a position is untenable. Instead, I contend that Yochanan was high priest, and that when he was killed, the honor passed to one of his sons. Now, a careful reading of both books of Maccabees would imply that although the Maccabees fought together as a group, each of the brothers, Yehuda, Yonasan, and Shimon, each had men who were loyal to them in particular. After Yehuda died, there was probably some internal wrangling before Yonasan's group prevailed, and he was appointed leader. This would also explain how Yonasan, the fourth brother, was appointed leader before Shimon, who was the second brother by all accounts. Which of the brothers was the only one who did not lead an army, and as such lacked a loyal group of followers? That's right, Yochanan, the high priest. It is interesting that Maccabees 1 calls him, quote, leader of the multitude, or, in another translation, appointee over the people. If this was some sort of military position, we ought to have heard something about it. I believe it is a veiled allusion to his position as high priest. Eventually, Yonasan's men must have appealed to Demetrius, and he conferred the high priesthood upon Yonasan in order to gain his support. As explained a number of times throughout this series, Maccabees 1 was commissioned by the descendants of Shimon the Maccabee. What this means is that the author will omit any information that might call into question Shimon's right to either the throne or the high priesthood. Any mention of Yochanan as high priest would challenge the legitimacy of Yonasan's high priesthood, and ultimately Shimon's. To reiterate, if Yochanan was high priest during the reign of Yehuda, why should his sons not be high priest during the reign of Yonasan and Shimon? That explains why there's no mention of Yochanan in the book of Maccabees. But what about Josephus? Why is there no mention of Yochanan by Josephus? We already know that Josephus adheres to Maccabees 1. But why? The answer to that question, my friends, is given by Josephus himself. In his autobiography, written as an appendix to his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus recounts his lineage. "I am descended from royal blood," he writes, "for my great-great-grandmother was the daughter of Yonasan, the high priest, who was the first of the sons of Chashmonai to hold the office of high priest." Josephus prides himself on being a descendant of Yonasan. It is inconceivable, then, that he would make any reference to Yochanan's high priesthood. But let's rewind for a second. Did we just hear Josephus say that Yonasan was the first of the Chashmonaim to serve as high priest? You recall, we quoted Josephus earlier as saying Yehuda was high priest, an assertion repeated by him no less than 3 times in Antiquities. The problem with Josephus is not that he is a liar, but that he's a bad liar. In Antiquities, Josephus was afraid we might notice a gap of years in the high priesthood, and he was quick to assure us that it was filled by Yehuda. In his autobiography, however, Josephus forgot what he had said earlier and reverted back to the official record of Maccabees, wherein Yonasan was the first high priest of the Chashmonaim. Josephus, you see, is a bad specimen of the second kind of historian. This appropriation of the high priesthood may have been a sore point for many of the faithful. 40 years later, during the reign of Yochanan Hyrcanus, son of Shimon, or possibly his son Yanai, himself a Kohen Gadol, we come across an account in the Talmud in which an elder levels the following insult at Yochanan. "O king, does the crown not suffice for you, that you also seek the priesthood?" To my mind, the elder is saying to Hyrcanus, keep the monarchy and return the high priesthood to the descendants of Yochanan. Although, according to the Talmud, this insult stemmed from a rumor about Hyrcanus' mother having been held captive in Moedin, I wonder whether that rumor was in the first place the result of underlying discontent with Shimon's high priesthood. Back to the scroll, Yochanan pulls out his sword and kills Nicanor in the holy courtyard. There is no mention in the scroll of Nicanor's arm and head being cut off and brought back to Jerusalem, for the scroll maintains he had been killed in the temple. There is an indication in Maccabees 1 that Nicanor was killed prior to the rest of the army, but it seems like that occurred at the battle in Beis Chorain. Maccabees 2, on the other hand, intimates that Nicanor was found dead in his armor after they had returned from war. Then there comes an interesting passage that reads as follows, quote, "And the chief warrior, who fought with heart and soul for his people, and who was ever faithful to his brothers, ordered Nicanor's head and arm to be cut off and brought to Jerusalem." Although the chief warrior is not mentioned by name, it is assumed to refer to Yehuda. Still, I wonder, can the chief warrior not perhaps be Yochanan? Except at the Battle of Emmaus, Maccabees 2 never mentions any of the Maccabee brothers by name, with the exception of Yehuda and Shimon. Even when he kills the elephant, Elazar is referred to only as, quote, "the brave warrior." And so, I wonder. It should be noted that the account in Megillas Tainus presented in episode 3 reads similar to that of Maccabees. Either way, It would seem odd to bring Nicanor's head and arm into the holy temple, and thus defile it just to make a point. Indeed, in contrast to Maccabees 2, who states that they were brought into the temple courtyard, Megillus Tainus and Lahavdil Maccabees 1 mention only that they were hung in Jerusalem facing the holy temple. One way or another, either Megillus Tainus and the scroll of Antiochus comport with each other, and therefore with the secular account as well, or else we have a case of conflicting historical accounts in Chazal, which is rare but not entirely uncommon. Now, the high casualty count in the war with Nicanor, 72,700, is just over double the number given in Maccabees 2. It is well known that ancient accounts of war tend either to over or under-exaggerate sizes of armies as well as death counts. Although there appears to be no rhyme and reason to particular numbers given, I would contend that even in exaggeration, the ancient accounts are conveying accurate historical information, each in their own way. We find this concept in the laws of Ksuba, the halachic marriage document. Rambam writes, quote, "There are various customs regarding the amount of a woman's dowry recorded in the Ksuba. In some places, it is customary to state a higher figure than what was actually received, increasing the number by a third, a fifth, or a half, so as to appear more generous in the eyes of the people. Conversely, there are places where it is customary to write a lesser amount. These higher and lower numbers are not considered untruthful, since the underlying intent and meaning of the number given is clear. In a place where it is customary to write a higher number, one does not have the option of writing a lower number, or else the real number will be assumed to be even lower. This is somewhat akin to official crowd estimates given by the media nowadays. In some cases, if the media says there were 100,000 demonstrators at an event, you can safely assume there were no more than 10,000. In other cases, it is the other way around. Since the number given by Maccabees is no less than 35,000, and the number given by the scroll is just over twice that amount, we can safely assume they are both providing us with the same tally. Whether the number in the scroll is over-exaggerated or the number in Maccabees under-exaggerated is not important. The authors of each, writing in their individual milieus, were obligated to conform to the writing customs of the day, or else their intent would be misunderstood. What is important, though, is the miraculous nature of this victory, in which Nicanor's entire force was decimated, the enemies falling upon and killing each other. Now that Nicanor was killed, Demetrius had all the information he needed, and he sent for the evil Bacchides to instate Alcimus as high priest and put down the revolt once and for all. Bacchides traveled to Jerusalem and asked to meet with Yehuda. Yehuda realized that Bacchides had come for war and not peace, and avoided him. Still, a number of leaders of the Jewish people and the pious men decided to trust Bacchides, seeing that he was accompanied by Alcimus. But he betrayed their trust and killed them. Before we continue, though, let us ask the question, just who is Alcimus? The Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah states as follows. When Yaakov brought the food to Yitzchak, it says he smelled the scent of his clothing, begodov, and he blessed him. Says the Medrash, do not read it begodov, his clothing, but rather boigdov, his traders. This refers to Yokum ish Tzroiros, Yokim of the city of Tzroiros. Yokim ish Tzroiros was the nephew of Yosei ben Yoyezer, leader of the Sanhedrin. Joachim was riding a horse on Shabbos, and behind him were men carrying a gallows on which his uncle was to be hanged. He turned to his uncle and said, "See the horse my master has placed me upon, and see the horse," meaning the gallows, "your master has placed you upon." Replied Rabbi Yossi, "If this is the payment of those who anger God, how much more will be the reward of those who follow his will?" Said Joachim, "Is there anyone who has followed his will more than you?" His uncle replied, "Indeed, if such punishment is what befalls those who follow his will, how much more will they suffer those who transgress his will?" Rabbi Yossi's words permeated Joachim like a viper's venom, and he committed suicide by simultaneously stoning, burning, stabbing, and choking himself. Before he died, Rabbi Yossi saw a vision of Joachim's bed floating in the air and declared, "He beat me to Gan Eden by a few minutes." Joachim ish Tzroiros, nephew of Yosei ben Yoezer ish Tzreida, is none other than the high priest Yakimus or Alkimus. Some conjecture they even hailed from the same town, that Tzreida and Tzroiros are one and the same. But their life journeys took them down very different paths. Yossi was the leader of the faithful Jews and was known as the pious Kohen, as mentioned in episode 1. Alkimus was the leader of the Hellenists. Yossi fought for the purity of the Jewish nation. Alkimus accompanied Bacchides, who made 13 breaches in the Seireg wall and called for assimilation. We can only conjecture that Yosei ben Yoezer was among the leaders of the pious who trusted Bacchides and whose trust Bacchides betrayed. Hachi kara shmoi Bagdis? He was not called Bagdis for nothing. Bagdis, like Boigdov, means traitor. He was indeed the evil Bagdis who misled the Jews and betrayed their trust. You can well imagine the great fear that gripped the Jewish people after their spiritual leader, Yosei ben Yoezer, had been killed by Bacchides. Not only the faithful, but even the Hellenists must have been shaken by this craven act of treason. A dark period ensued, and the scroll enumerates all of the wicked decrees initiated by Bacchides and the heroic self-sacrifice of the Jews. Whether or not all of these incidents occurred at this time is up for debate. Chazal may have chosen to list all of these incidents together since they are thematically linked, though some of them may have occurred earlier under Antiochus Epiphanes. Specifically, the incident in which 1,000 Jews are choked to death by the evil Greeks, which is recorded in Maccabees 1 at the very beginning of Antiochus's campaign of spiritual annihilation. Alternatively, these decrees may be attributed to Bacchides for yet another reason. As we have already learned, Bacchides was a close friend of Antiochus IV, and it is possible that he was among those who incited Antiochus to persecute the Jews in the first place. We might even speculate that it was for that very reason that Demetrius enlisted Bacchides' assistance when he decided on his own campaign of persecution. It was at this time that the Greeks enacted the decrees mentioned in Medrash Chanukah and Megillas Tainus. Quote, "Write on your drawbars and on the horns of your oxen and on the foreheads of your donkeys that you have no portion in the God of Israel." It appears that Bacchides was an amoral psychopath without a conscience and an expert at psychological warfare. He realized the demoralizing effect the murder of their leaders would have on the Jewish people and perpetrated it without compunction. He killed a large number of Jews and buried them in a mass grave. At that time, there was a famine in the land, and the faithful were forced to submit to the Hellenists. Although Maccabees 1 purports these events to have occurred during the second campaign of Bacchides after Yehuda's death, I am suggesting they took place earlier, during the first campaign, following the chronology of Chazal and Lahavdil, Maccabees 2. Yochanan was banished from the Holy Temple, and Alcimus was installed in his place. It seemed like things had totally reverted back to the bad old days of Antiochus Epiphanes. Yehuda's allies were hunted and tortured, and the Hellenists were restored to power. Even the Maccabee brothers were demoralized. It was at this time that the incident recording in Medrash Chanukah occurred. The apex of his psychological campaign against the Jews was the violation of the Jewish brides. Bacchides knew nothing would be more demoralizing and crushing than forcing the Jews to offer up their own sisters to the enemy. In fact, this decree was so terrible and difficult for the Jews to endure that it was intentionally omitted from the historical record. Instead, Maccabees 1 and Josephus are deliberately vague, simply stating that, quote, such a calamity had not befallen the Jewish people since the days of the prophets. For this same reason, it was erased from most copies of the scroll of Antiochus as well. Further evidence of the terrible state of affairs in Judea is the fact that Maccabees 2 concludes suddenly after the war with Nicanor. As mentioned earlier, Maccabees 2 is a dramatic account of good and evil, where the good first suffered terribly, but ultimately went out in the end. Any mention of Bacchides and his evil decrees, and the return to the state of Shmad, spiritual annihilation, not to mention the death of the book's protagonist, Yehuda the Maccabee, would run contrary to the spirit of the narrative. Even Elazar's death is omitted, although there is mention of his heroic act. Had things been any less bad, Maccabees 2 could have included at least the first war against Bacchides. However, the situation being what it was, the author had no choice but to terminate his account. This state of affairs went on for some time. Then, when the Maccabees had all but given up hope, came the marriage of Chana, the daughter of Yochanan, to Elazar ben Chashmenoi. I am inclined to believe that Elazar ben Chashmenoi is not the same as Elazar the Maccabee, who had been killed earlier in the war against Antiochus Eupator. Jewish travelers to the city of Akko in the 12th and 13th centuries report that one of the gates to the city is called the Chashmenoi Gate, since it is near the burial place of Elazar ben Chashmenoi. The Maccabee brothers, by contrast, are known to be buried in Moedim. How Elazar ended up being buried in Akko is not entirely clear, but here's a thought. You will recall we mentioned in part 1 that Yonasan was ambushed by Trypho and put to death. This event occurred in the city of Akko. Maccabees states, when Yonasan arrived in Akko, the people of Akko closed the gates behind him and took him hostage and killed all who had come with him. It is possible that Elazar ben Chashmenoi was one of those who accompanied Yonasan and was killed at that time. Although the scroll treats Elazar the Maccabee as if he were alive the entire time, and his death is recorded only after the last war with Bacchides, a careful reading of these verses may indicate that they are in fact an appendix to an earlier account. The scroll wanted to mention all of the Maccabee brothers, and so it recalls Elazar as well, although he had been killed much earlier. Rather than begin the scroll with Elazar's demise, his death is noted only after the final war against Bacchides, the only other war to include elephants. At the wedding of the daughter of Yochanan, listening to her impassioned cries, the Maccabee brothers are roused to action, and the revolt is taken up once again. Bacchides is expelled and returns to Antioch, where he plots his return. Let us pause at this point to consider the following. Earlier, we made the claim that both campaigns of Bacchides occurred after the death of Nicanor, and we presented our reasonings. This assertion is supported by Maccabees 2 as well, as mentioned above. We further postulated that the terrible decrees mentioned in Maccabees 1 as having occurred after the death of Yehuda actually took place before. Why then would the author of Maccabees 1 choose to interpolate the story of Nicanor between the two campaigns of Bacchides? To answer this question, we must again consider the aim and purpose of Maccabees 1: to preserve the honor and legacy of the Hashmonai dynasty. According to the narrative, the Maccabees were a stalwart group and unshakable in their conviction and bravery, never wavering in the face of adversity. That such evil should befall the Jews could only have occurred after the death of Yehuda the Maccabee. There was no way evildoers could sprout forth in that way while Yehuda was still alive. There is no way the land could have just gone to pieces, submitting wholesale to the Hellenists. No, these things could have occurred only after Yehuda's demise. And so, the first campaign of Bacchides is cut short. A great victory against Nicanor is won, and Yehuda dies early in Bacchides' second campaign. Only then do things fall apart. This is the only narrative Maccabees 1 can afford. Additionally, Maccabees would like for the Hashmonai dynasty to extend as far back as possible. If the holiday established by Yehuda, commemorating the victory against Antiochus Epiphanes, is rendered meaningless, if things end up not only as bad, but even worse, if the second victory is won not solely by the Maccabee brothers, but by a coalition of Hashmonaim that includes Elazar ben Hashmonai, then the prestige of the Maccabee brand is damaged. In keeping with the narrative, then, the second period of Shmad is intentionally obscured, though not outright falsified. The author of Maccabees is an honest historian after all. Yehuda and his brothers expelled Bacchides, but he returned soon thereafter with a huge army of foreign mercenaries that included also armored elephants. As the Seleucids' elephants had been crippled earlier, hamstrung by the Romans, Demetrius had to get new elephants. Historians tell us that by then elephants were harder to come by, and that the Seleucid Empire therefore invested heavily in the protective armor worn by the elephants. This new reality is reflected in the scroll, which states, Ve'imhoin pilaya melupshe shiryana. They brought along armored elephants. It was during this second campaign of Bacchides that the Seirig wall was breached. When exactly Alcimus died is not essential to our discussion and will be discussed elsewhere. The brothers set out to fight Bacchides once again. Before battle, they are visited by their father Matisyahu, who blesses them and compares them to their brave ancestors who also fought for the sake of heaven. Heavily outnumbered, Yehuda is killed in battle and his army destroyed. Bacchides kidnaps the children of the leaders of the Jews, sounds familiar, and holds them hostage in the Acra. He fortifies many cities, placing garrisons of Greek soldiers in them to harass the Jews. At some point, the remaining 3 brothers are again visited by their father, who promises this time to accompany them in war. How much time has passed between Yehuda's death and the final war is impossible to judge from the scroll. Yochanan's death is not mentioned in the scroll. This is either because the miracle of the oil occurred prior to it, or because Chazal saw no purpose in recording his death at the hands of the Arabs of Medva. Remember, Chazal were particular in which details they chose to record and which to omit, and were not just writing for the historical record. The final war is fought at Beis Beitzoi. Bacchides besieges the city and begins to erect towers and war machines. Yonasan sneaks out, raises an army, and begins capturing city after city. Finally, he reaches Beis Beitzoi, and the Maccabees launch a two-pronged attack at Bacchides, crushing him. Bacchides, who has already grown tired of the Hellenists, kills a number of them and promises to free the captives if he is allowed to return home in peace. The rest of this account in Maccabees is somewhat unclear, as he tells us on the one hand that Bacchides returned the captives, and on the other that the hostages in the Acra fortress were released only later by Demetrius. Either way, according to Maccabees, Bacchides returns home alive. This appears to contradict the scroll, which states that he was burned to death. One possibility is that he was killed later, perhaps somewhere near Aleppo, in a revenge operation carried out by some of the Maccabees. There is perhaps a slight indication of this in the scroll, as Bacchides' death is recorded only after the victory of the Jews, the appended account of the death of Elazar, and the elimination of the Hellenists, implying, perhaps, that he was killed later. Now, after Bacchides was either killed or sent home in disgrace, the Maccabees returned to the Holy Temple, this time for good. They rebuilt the gates and the Seirig wall, and they cleansed the Azara from the profanities and the corpses. But when they wanted to light the menorah, on the 25th of Kislev, they found that all of the oil had been defiled. Searching high and low, all they could find was a single cruse of pure olive oil, with the seal of the high priests from the days of the prophet Shmuel, with enough oil for but one day. They lit the menorah, and Hashem made a miracle, and it burned for 8 days, and the Jews ate latkes happily ever after. The preceding verse in the scroll is rather fascinating. Quote, when King Antiochus heard that his deputy Bagris and all of his officers had been killed, he boarded a ship and fled overseas. Everywhere he went, the people rebelled against him and would taunt him, shouting, "Fugitive, fugitive," and he threw himself into the sea. In his description of the war between Alexander Balas and Demetrius, Josephus writes that the people hated Demetrius because he was arrogant and indolent and ignored the affairs of the land. He had shut himself up in a palace of 4 towers near Antioch and received no one. The Roman historian Livy writes, it is a known fact that Demetrius was drunk for most of the day. Here's where it gets interesting. There is an island near Antioch that was incorporated into the city by Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. Now, the Aramaic word yama, sea, is used by Chazal to refer to any body of water, be it a sea, a river, or a lake. Fled overseas could just as easily mean crossed the river and retired to the island. In later times, the island contained a palace, a hippodrome, that is, a circus, a temple, and other buildings. In short, anything a king might need. Could Demetrius have used the island in a similar fashion? If so, then perhaps the meaning of the verse is as follows. Upon hearing that Bacchides had been killed, Demetrius grew depressed, and he fled to the island of Antioch, where he had built himself a large palace. There he indulged in drink day and night, and neglected communal affairs. The people obviously hated him, and would call him nasty names. What better name to taunt Demetrius with than fugitive? After all, he had begun his rule as a fugitive from Rome, and that stain had never left him. In the end, the people rebelled and went over to Alexander Ballas. Following Rasag's version of the scroll, Demetrius eventually committed suicide by driving his horse into a deep lake. The narrative presented in Josephus, wherein the drunken king dies a hero's death, rings a bit hollow. I would not be surprised if it was a myth created by Polybius to cover for his friend's ignoble end. The scroll continues. From that time onward, the Greeks lost their dominion, and the sons of Hashmonoi and their posterity obtained kingship. From this time until the destruction of the temple, there was a period of 206 years. As mentioned in Part 1, after the death of Demetrius, the Seleucid kingdom was thrown into upheaval, and for a time was even split in half, and the empire steadily declined. The land of Israel finally gained its independence, and the Hashmonaim obtained kingship under Shimon around the year 140. From that time until the destruction of the temple, there was a period of between 206 to 208 years, consistent with our scroll and Chazal in Seder Olam. The year given at the beginning of the scroll, the 213th year of the temple, is, I believe, a later emendation, inserted at some point so that the dates at the beginning and the end of the scroll would match. It should be noted also that the verses quoted above do not appear in many of the old Aramaic copies, including the version used by Reb Sadia Gaon. Now, according to Reb Shimon Kaira, in his authoritative Sefer Halachis Gedolos, which contains an unbroken tradition on various aspects of Jewish law, extending back all the way to the Amoraim and Tanoim, the scroll of Antiochus was authored by the elders of the academies of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were the leaders of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, a full century before the destruction. Accordingly, the elders of these academies must have been writing while the temple still stood in Jerusalem. Any mention of the temple's destruction in the scroll must therefore be a later addition. The Chanukah miracle is dated by most rabbinic sources to around the year 140, in accordance with the scroll. As this is the only year mentioned by Chazal in connection to the Hashmonaim, it is as good a date as any. The years 140, when Israel gained its independence, and 164, when the temple was first cleansed and the holiday established by Yehuda, are about equidistant from the miracle of the oil, which occurred circa 154. On a separate note, 140 may also be the date that the Jews began to say Hallel on Chanukah. According to Rava, the reason we don't say Hallel on Purim is that we had not obtained total freedom, as we were still subjects of Achashverosh. But until Shimon, we were still technically subjects of the Seleucids. In that sense, the Chanukah celebration was not fully complete until approximately 206 years before the destruction. To summarize, Chanukah was established by Yehuda the Maccabee in the year 164, after the Jews emerged from a period of darkness to light. Yehuda proclaimed an 8-day holiday to commemorate the rededication of the temple. It would be a while, however, before the holiday of Chanukah was ratified by Chazal, the Jewish sages. Perhaps they were waiting for a sign from heaven that God favored the establishment of this holiday. In the meantime, things fell apart, and darkness again descended upon the Jewish nation and the Holy Land. Finally, after many trials and tribulations, during which time 2 of the Maccabee brothers died al Kiddush Hashem, the temple was cleansed for the second time. This time, God made a miracle, and the small cruse of oil lasted for 8 days, confirming the holiday Yehuda had called for a decade earlier. In a sense, it is similar to the holiday of Purim, which was proposed by Mordechai and then later ratified by the Sanhedrin. Holding this new perspective in mind, let us now examine the Gemara in Tractate Shabbos 21b, which famously inquires into the origins of the holiday of Chanukah. My Chanukah, asks the Gemara. What is Chanukah? What is Chanukah? What kind of a question is that? Was the story of Chanukah a mystery at the time of the Gemara? Did they not kindle the Chanukah lights? Rashi, the foremost commentator on the Gemara, explains that the question being posed is Al Eze Nes Kavuha. Which miracle was the holiday established to commemorate? In light of what we have explained above, this question makes perfect sense. The Gemara is asking, is Chanukah Yehuda's holiday established after the first restoration of the temple, or is it primarily a holiday established after Yehuda's death at the second rededication after the miracle of the oil? The Gemara responds by quoting Megillas Tainus. Quote, on the 25th of Kislev, the 8 days of Chanukah commence. For when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all of the oil that was there. When the house of Hashmonai prevailed and the Greeks were vanquished, they searched for oil and found but a single jug with the seal of the high priest, with enough oil to light for just 1 day. A miracle occurred, and it burned for 8 days. The next year, it was established as a holiday with offerings of praise and thanks. In other words, Megillas Tainus makes it clear that the holiday of Chanukah was established primarily through the miracle of the oil. Unbeknownst to most, however, is that this is only half of what Megillas Tainus has to say. The rest of the passage, not quoted by the Gemara, actually continues as follows. Quote, and why was Chanukah established for 8 days if Moshe's dedication of the tabernacle and Shlomo's dedication of the temple were for but 7 days? The reason is because in the times of the Greeks, the house of Hashmonai entered the sanctuary and built a new altar and coated it with lime, and they fashioned new vessels, and they worked diligently at this for 8 days. And why is it celebrated for all generations? Since it occurred at a time that they emerged from distress to comfort, and they offered praise and thanks. End quote. At first glance, this section is incomprehensible. What does it mean, why was Chanukah established for 8 days? Hasn't that question already been answered in the preceding section? Chanukah is an 8-day holiday because the oil burned for 8 days. In light of all that has been said, however, this section makes perfect sense. After explaining that we celebrate Chanukah for 8 days on account of the oil, Megillas Tainus proceeds to inquire why the original holiday, ordained by Yehuda, was established for 8 days as well. After all, at that time, the menorah did not burn for 8 days. This, the Megillah answers, is on account of the Chanukah's HaMizbeach, the dedication of the altar and the temple, which took 8 days to complete. Megillas Tainus then continues, but why is it celebrated for all generations? After all, the Jews were soon cast back into darkness, and their salvation all but erased. Why do we continue to celebrate not only the miracle of the oil, but also the victory of Yehuda? And the answer is given, since it occurred at a time that they emerged from distress to comfort, and they offered praise and thanks. Because the Jews sincerely offered thanks to God when He brought them out of hardship, Yehuda's holiday was ultimately confirmed by God. In the end, Chanukah is a multifaceted celebration of multiple events spanning more than a decade, all of which culminate on the 25th of Kislev, a day that had been ordained by God for rededication since the times of our teacher Moshe. Psikta Rabsi writes, "The tabernacle was completed on the 25th of Kislev, but it was not dedicated until Nisan. God said, 'I will give that day its due in the days of the Chashmonaim.'" Allow me to add one more thing. Admittedly, some of what has been offered here is quite novel, perhaps even a bit radical, and I've been hesitant to share my point of view for quite some time. Nevertheless, I decided to take the plunge because I wanted to demonstrate clearly the accuracy and eternal relevance of the teachings of Chazal. After formulating the central ideas presented in this series, I happened to come across a talk of the Lubavitcher Rebbe from Likutei Sichos, volume 15, in Yiddish, that to my mind justified the undertaking. The Rebbe there discusses the Chanukah hymn of Haneres Halalu, customarily recited after lighting the Chanukah candles. The Nusach Ari version of Haneres Halalu reads as follows: "We light these candles to proclaim the salvations, miracles, and wonders that you wrought for our ancestors in those days at this time." The Rebbe goes on to discuss the order of salvations, miracles, and wonders. These, he says, follow the historical arc of the Chanukah story. Salvations are hidden miracles that can be explained as natural occurrences. The Chanukah story begins in Moediin, as Matisyahu and his sons overpower and wipe out the Greek unit that tries to force them to offer a pagan sacrifice. As there were not many Greek soldiers present in Moediin, it was not an obvious and overt miracle. Here, the Rebbe references the book of Maccabees and Yosifun. Although these are not rabbinically acclaimed sources, the Rebbe accepts their accounts as veritable. There were other wars, says the Rebbe, whose outcome could also be explained away as the result of expert planning and military prowess, including the war on Jerusalem, presumably a reference to the campaign of Lysias, in which the Jews were almost defeated and barely escaped. Then came the great victories of the few against the many and the weak against the strong. Here he references the scroll of Antiochus and Medrash Chanukah, presumably in connection with the wars against Nicanor and then Bacchides. These wars could only be termed miraculous. That was followed by the wondrous discovery of the cruse of pure olive oil. Not an outright miracle per se, but a wonder God had wrought for his people. This was, of course, followed by the additional miracle of the oil, and so on. Though not an explicit confirmation of the theories presented here, I would like to think that I can find tacit support in the Rebbe's words for our timeline of events. I encourage you to read the Sikha yourself, as well as a related Sikha in Hebrew in volume 10 of Likutei Sichos. We have arrived at the end of our journey. Dear friends, we are living in tumultuous times. If some of what has been conveyed here sounds eerily like current events, that's because not much has changed in over 2,000 years. The Jewish people have been and always will be a nation that stands alone. The enemies of today are the enemies of the past, using similar tactics for the same purpose, to uproot and destroy the chosen people. But just as Hashem brought salvation to his people then, so too does his ongoing protection continue to shield us today. The Jewish people are an eternal nation because we are bound by virtue of our souls to the eternal Creator of heaven and earth. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation and look forward to hearing from you. Please direct all comments, inquiries, and suggestions to jewishhistoryIOP@gmail.com.